What it do, everybody? It's your boy King Crowder back again with another edition of History You May Not Know and Things That Are Not Taught in Detail for Sure. Today's lesson, I'm going to take a centralized view into a subject that we learned briefly about the white flight and how it happened. What is white flight? White flight is when you saw a lot of European descendant Americans moving away from cities due to post-emancipation, when Black Americans began to build up their own properties and communities. You got to think about this. Most of the time, the towns that were being built up that the white people dispersed away from were Black communities that were thriving at one point. So they chose to leave this area because they had the stereotype that I will not and I refuse to live near or around Black Americans. So white flight came about when you began to see FH loan prices begin to get approved. So if you don't realize what FHA is, it's a standardized home that you saw and got approved for right during government housing structure. The height of white flight took place predominantly during the Great Migration, when you saw Black Americans leaving the South due to Jim Crow racism. So you began to see cities like Chicago, New York, LA. You began to see those white people moving away because they did not want to live nowhere near a Black person. So that's when you began to hear the suburbs being built. Suburban living, Levitt towns, and other communities. This was a systematic effort to allow white people to have communities that they can build up with newer homes with briefly and small interest rates. A lot of white wealth in these towns were built in all white communities. They began to self-segregate themselves because they did not want the others around. What people do not know is that this is an effect that came and produced sundown towns. But let's stick back to white flight. White flight was detrimental to a lot of these urban cities because you got to think, they had housing, so when they left, all their communities and businesses that they once had were there was simply gone. They got new government funding, GI bills, and dirt cheap housing that the Black residents that were stuck in those areas, a lot of them had dilapidated buildings. So even on the Black side of town was still thriving in ways. You begin to see the white areas that were once civilized and built in began to be built down. The best way I want you to remember this, if you can look at New York City map, that 85% of the suburban residents were literally inside the urban cities in the 1930s and 40s. You began to see people that were what you call predatory lenders buying homes at low prices. Some effects from the white flight that came down that most people don't know about. Have you ever went to an urbanized area inside certain cities and you just see the homes looking terrible? That is because slumlords usually own those buildings. This was a result of white flight and never being repaired throughout the history. So, they would buy the buildings, they wouldn't fix them, they made them look dilapidated just to ensure the property value went down and the government produced eminent domain. Many people do not know that white flight had almost 3 adverse effects. You began to see them leave the city. You began to see home prices decrease rapidly. And you began to see slumlords holding on to this property, keeping the Black people in those areas unable to refinance properly. White flight is a subject that should be studied. In most majority cities, I want you to look at this. I can almost implement where most of the Black residents live. I want you to pay attention. Near train tracks, south or southeast side of town, or near where producing or chemical plants are at. They literally self-segregate those people, as you've learned before, with redlining and other government systemic programs. But you can see, if you look at time throughout history, why things are the way they are. White flight. It is a community effort to self-segregate themselves, wanting to live by no one but who they deemed acceptable. It is one of the greatest unfocused events of U.S. history. White flight produced sundown towns, self-segregated cities and caused it hard for most people to live in. White flight is the single greatest tragedy of the 20th century. Continue to read, self-study, and educate yourself. This is the breakdown on how white flight had more implements and harsher effects than we know. It's your boy King Crowder, checking back out again with another historical event. This time we focused on the subject of white flight. Hopefully you learned something about the subject. Please make sure you hit the subscribe button. Any other questions, let me know below. It's your boy checking out. Peace.